Okay.
Well, good morning. I'm going to fill in for Justin today. He possibly was exposed to somebody with COVID, so he's staying home. So we're just going to do kind of a fill-in study. I don't want to get into anything too in-depth, so we're going to do a broad overview. This is actually, if you've ever heard of the Peacemaking series by Ken Sandy. Ken is, I don't know if he's retired or not, but he's a PCA pastor. He may actually have been an OPC as well. But he wrote a book called Peacemaking, and a lot of churches have actually gone through it together. But so we're that certainly could be something that we do down the road, but we're going to just kind of do an overview. And the whole concept of peacemaking is exactly what it says, peacemaking. So how do we make peace biblically, as opposed to there's a biblical way to resolve conflicts, and there's an unbiblical way. So we just want to kind of do a broad overview of that. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at some verses in the Bible, and then we'll make some determination of, first of all, what type of peacemaking was used. That's what we're going to do first, is look at the different types of peacemaking, both the biblical ones and the unbiblical ones. And then we're going to look at passages in the Bible, and we're going to decide, was this a good example or a not so good example? So that's where we're going to start. So in order to do that, I need you guys to think a little bit. So let's define conflict at a very high level. How would you define conflict? Just real generally. We've all had conflict in our lives. Well, how would you put a definition to that? 10 words or less.
Differing of opinion.
A differing of opinion, okay. And why is there conflict? So a differing of opinion implies
That it matters.
It matters to at least one party in some way, right? Typically, so that means there's two parties involved. I guess you could be in conflict with yourself and have an argument inside your head, but we're talking about more conflict where there's two parties. It might be two individuals, or it could be two groups of people. And
it might be an emotional and combative elements to their disagreement.
Yeah, okay. You could even think of it from a Christian perspective, the battle between what we ought to do and what we want to do, right? We're all constantly battling sin, but we're thinking more typically conflicts between parties or groups of people. So we've got a blank slate, so let's try and cover the entire spectrum from good conflict to bad conflict. What would be some words that could describe different types of conflicts?
Argument.
An argument, okay. All right. Okay.
War.
So let me rephrase the question. How might you an argument is something that would cause conflict. How might you resolve a conflict? What are the different ways that you can resolve conflict, either good or bad? Talking, okay.
Could be good or bad.
Okay.
True.
How about negotiating?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to use more clinical terms to try and put a bow around this. So negotiation. Hopefully this is a good thing. We'll talk about that a little bit, but certainly. So negotiation, trying to work it out. What else? Would be a really bad way to resolve a conflict?
Shooting.
Okay. Shooting that could cause death, maybe? So, murder?
Murder. Yes.
What if you shoot someone and it doesn't cause death?
Violence.
Violence or
Worse.
assault? Again, I apologize if I misspell anything. It's just a habit when I'm writing.
Another way of solving it would be just the person who has authority who says it's my way, and I'm sorry if you don't like it, but that's the way it's going to be.
Okay. So, yes. So, are there any lawyers in here? Think about the civil courts. What would you call the civil justice system? It's where somebody else is rendering a decision and you have to abide by You guys know what you would call that?
I know about it, but I can explain it.
You think about when sports stars are going through contract negotiations. Sometimes they can't come to an agreement, and so they go into
Mediate.
Arbitration.
I've heard a couple terms: mediation, and then I heard arbitration. Do you know what the difference between mediation and arbitration is? It's very subtle. So actually, if you're speaking in legal terms, so mediation is where two parties would agree that a third party would hear the evidence, hear the information, and would give a judgment, but it's not binding. So mediation is the parties agree that, okay, we'll let a third person hear this and give us their feedback or their input, but we're not bound to it legally. Whereas arbitration is actually more legal. It's where two parties agree, we're going to let this other party that we both agreed to render a decision, and we both are legally bound to it, whether we like the results or not. So that's the difference between mediation and arbitration. So what about our court systems? What do we do when we have conflict? How do you get into the court system?
Sue somebody.
Okay. Sue someone, so litigation. And I'm writing these in columns. We'll explain that in a minute. But yeah, definitely litigation. Andy?
You could defer to the other person's wishes just out of love.
Okay. How about if I call that overlooking? You might say forgiveness, but I'm just going to broadly call it as overlooking. So whatever your position is that you feel that there's conflict, you just say, I'm going to drop it.
So the negative of that might be ignoring.
Okay.
Like it can be done in two different spirits, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put ignore in there too, because ignore. Okay, you could deny or ignore it. What about, so if you thought of murder as like the ultimate on one end, what if you took that to the other end? What if you were in a conflict and it didn't result in you murdering someone else? What would be another way to resolve the conflict?
Murdered you?
Okay, that's still, yeah.
Then you don't have to worry.
Oh, wouldn't that be that overlook or
Could be.
concede?
Could you harm yourself in some way?
Emotionally.
Okay. How do some people resolve a conflict?
You're talking about suicide?
Yeah, suicide. If you think about it, it is a way to resolve the conflict. The conflict is over. So you could take your own life. How else, and we're starting to develop a pattern here that I'm going to explain. What does the church do? What's the way a church tries to resolve conflict? What if you found a brother or sister in sin? How does the church, the biblical model, what do they do?
You go to that person,
Okay, you go one-on-one.
and then if they don't, then you go back to the church, and the church becomes involved.
So you go one-on-one, then you bring a few others along.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't work, then you bring the church involvement. Just broadly, I'll call that accountability. So an accountability model. And I guess, so part of that, if you had this accountability model and it was successful, what would we call that? What would be the goal of an accountability model? Restoration and reconciliation. I mean, ultimately, that's the end result that you're trying to seek. Okay. Andy?
Well, in the church setting, of course, and really in every setting, most settings, the relationship preserving the relationship is a very important part of dealing with the problem. So if you're not just trying to come to the right decision, but you have to come to the decision in the right manner to preserve the relationship.
Yes, absolutely. Philip?
Yeah, so totally agree. You mentioned arbitration, and the church system of hearing conflicts and then rendering a verdict basically is arbitration in a large sense. And what happens when two Christians or more than two Christians are at odds with each other? No matter how much they're at odds with each other, when they come into the context of the church, whatever problem they have is not nearly as big or important as the unity and harmony of the church. And so church discipline and church arbitration, it's calling people to understand, our conflicts, they're happening, they're real, but we're called by Christ to reconcile for the good of the body.
Which, again, this is all under the peacemaking umbrella. So we're trying to look at ways that would be more biblical in resolving conflict, and then looking at ways that aren't. So have you ever, in a spousal relationship, have you ever stormed out of the room during a conflict? Not that I would ever do that, but anybody familiar with that?
No, it's not.
Is that a way to resolve the conflict?
Depends on who.
Not a biblical way, but is it a method? Is it a technique that some people use? I guess is my question. So I'm saying that just to throw another one into the mix. I'll just call it flight. So.
Will you fly to the next room?
Or
Close the door.
it could be manipulation. It could be a technique.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I hadn't thought of that one, but yeah. Okay, can you think of any others? I've kind of exhausted everything on my list. I think we could say some terms and we'd probably categorize them into one of these. So here's the question. So I very conveniently put these into 3 columns. Would anybody care to take a guess as to what these columns might have in common or why I've organized them this way?
Healthy, unhealthy, biblical, non-biblical.
Okay. Which ones would be, if I'm correct, which ones would be more of a biblical model? The middle one?
Middle.
What did you say, Ross?
He said Old Testament or New Testament.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give these a label of peacemaking. So these are models. Obviously, the biblical model is looking at accountability, overlooking. This would be true biblical model. Going to that person in private, bringing a few others along. If you can't resolve it, telling it to the church. That is the biblical model. Arbitration is more in the civil courts. But if you think about it just in terms of it is a method that's available to all people, Christians and non-Christians. And it provides some level of order. Now, I'm not saying that the Bible's saying sue everybody and take them to court. In fact, it says exactly the opposite. But when I say peacemaking, these are ways that individuals can resolve conflict that don't result in potential harm either to yourself or to someone else. So just broadly, we're going to categorize these as peacemaking methods of conflict. So if these are peacemaking, how might we categorize this right-hand column? And let's use the same terminology. So, okay, now peacemaking, so these would be peace. What did you say, Cindy?
Breaking.
Peace breaking. Okay. That sound good? Okay. All right, so if that was peace breaking, and if these aren't necessarily biblical, how might we categorize these over here? Peace.
Avoiding.
Peace avoiding, okay.
Yeah.
I like that, but just to make it rhyme, I'm going to faking.
Faking. Oh.
This is just to make it so you guys can remember it now easier. So, and again, this is just a way for us to go through the study. So, peace faking responses, peacemaking, and peace breaking. So what we want to do is, we're going to actually look at some biblical examples, and we're going to decide whether it's a peacemaking response, which is a good response, or whether it's this peace faking or peace breaking. But before we do that, do you notice, can you make any generalizations about these categories? Do you see anything that either they have in common or that they have differences? Philip?
Well, I mean, one is balanced. The one in the middle, of course, is balanced, and it has a real desire for preserving a real relationship and for creating peace. The one on the left is avoidance. So it's fight or flight on either side of the middle column.
Right.
One's avoidance, one is domination and violence.
Yeah,
fight or flight.
Yeah, actually.
It's fleshly. They're both fleshly.
So this is more the fight, and this is more the flight.
And they're easier too, in general.
Yeah.
Okay.
The one in the middle involves time and hard, more difficult solutions, but more valuable solutions.
Okay. Good. Anything else? You guys see anything? Any other conclusions you can draw, Andy?
The peacemaking takes into account both person's points of view, honestly and respectfully. The others don't really seem to do that.
I'm probably getting too low for you guys to see, but and I'm going to get sloppier too. Okay, good. Yeah. What about if we were to, say the extremes on each end? What are the two extremes on each end? You've got suicide and you've got murder. So on the extreme ends, on the non-peacemaking models, both end in death. What else might we see? Anything else? You could say the non-peacemaking responses, ultimately they both end in death, but if it's not death, they both end in harm, either to yourself or the individual.
Both have negative outcomes.
Okay. Yeah, both are negative. Hopefully, this is a little more positive. The goal is positive, although in some cases, one of the parties may not be agree with it. Bill?
Well, both are cowardly. Both of the two on either end are cowardly. Either murder and litigation are cowardly because they remove you from having to deal with the person in a real way.
Okay, good. So hopefully we're developing this pattern where what we want to focus on, what we want to take away from this, is that as we deal with conflict, we should be seeking a peacemaking model. And hopefully we're seeking the biblical peacemaking model as opposed to the civil courts. Just one other thing that I've noted. So peacemaking is all about the self, right? Whereas peace breaking is about the other person. You're doing harm in one way, but in peace faking or peace avoiding, you're focused on yourself. Whereas in peace breaking, the fight mode, you're focused on the other person. So this is more self-focused. And then this is more other-focused. So the reason for doing this is to just give a broad overview, and then what we want to do is let's actually, so first of all, in the Bible, are there examples of good ways of peacemaking? Have you guys ever read a good example of peacemaking in the Bible? Have you read a not so good way of peacemaking? So we're just going to look at a few of those and try to apply this. So we'll keep this in mind, and this is where I need some help here. So Walt, if you don't mind, would you look at Genesis 16, verses 1 through 6. And we've actually just talked about this recently. So this is Abram and Sarah. So we're going to look at that a little bit. Cindy? Just to kind of be on deck, could you look at Genesis 39, 1 through 18? It's a little bit longer. And we've talked about this one too. It's about Joseph and Potiphar. But let's actually read these verses, and then let's apply this model here and see where things shake out. See if we can agree on what's happening here. So the first one we'll look at is Genesis 16. This is verses 1 through 6.
Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." And Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her.
So there's actually a lot going on in that one, isn't there? What do you think? Just some general comments on that. About any of the characters. What would you say? So Abraham avoided. Maybe pass the buck a little bit. What else do we see in there? What happened right at the end? Okay, so was there some flight, maybe, to avoid conflict?
Well, Sarah had the authority to do as she wished, and so she took it upon herself to have her own way and not really regard the other.
Right. Yeah, so in a broad example, we don't see a lot of peacemaking where there's a desire to have some type of reconciliation, consideration of both parties. There's a lot of peace faking, peace breaking in this. So that's not the model that we would hold up as, this is how we would resolve conflicts. We would just impose our will on somebody else, or we would run from the conflict. That's not where we would go. We would be looking for trying to understand how either party is offended, maybe just one party, and try to reconcile. The whole goal of peacemaking, biblical peacemaking, is reconciliation, restoration. Doesn't mean the relationship is necessarily going to be restored. Sometimes it isn't, but we're still trying to ensure that neither party feels grossly injured in some way. Okay, let's look at another one. This is a little bit longer. So Cindy, Genesis 39, 1 through 18. And Floyd, are you willing to read one?
Genesis, what was it?
Well, I'm going to have Cindy read Genesis 39, 1 through 18. Let's just go with that one, and then we'll go to the next one.
Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. But his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Joseph found favor in the eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of the household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you were his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went to the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." So she kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the story. "That Hebrew slave who brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house."
So I wanted to read this one. So this is interesting. There's obviously a lot going on, but the thing I wanted to point out, what was Joseph's response in this? How might you clarify Joseph's response? Flight, yeah. Well, wait a second. We said flight that's a peace-making thing, right?
Well, in this case, there was he had no power in the situation. He didn't have a platform to bring grievances or whatever, express his point of view. So I think that this was a valid response.
Sure. And so I guess just to clarify then, so in general, if you're fleeing conflict as avoidance, we would call that peace-faking. But when would flight be a good thing? When you're fleeing from sin, right?
But,
Bill?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say he tried to reconcile with her.
he tried to correct her, even gently and
Yeah.
reasonably, you know. He's calling her back to her station as the wife of Potiphar, you know. He's explaining why, you know, he's not insulting her, you know. He's doing everything right until he just can't take it anymore.
Right. Yeah.
And he's still right to flee, but yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Andy?
And that was my comment, basically. You started off trying to reason with her, giving her good arguments why they shouldn't be involved in one another.
Yeah, and so the flight in this case was really the response. So just as if you were trying to negotiate or have an accountability model, if that wasn't successful, you don't just commit murder on a person, right? I mean, but there are reasons to flee a conflict, and this is a good example of that. And then, obviously, Potiphar's wife. I mean, there's all sorts of just terrible sin in her life. She may not necessarily be in conflict. I mean, she's got her mission, but she's not interested in listening to reason in any way. She wants to have her way. So, any other comments on that one? Okay, so I want to do kind of a quick hit. Let's actually just look at real short verses. So Floyd, and let's identify the peacemaking response that this represents. So Proverbs, and here I'm going to give these to everybody. So Floyd, if you'll do Proverbs 19:11.
19:11.
Gigi, can you do one?
Yes.
Matthew 5:23 and 24. Ross and Amy, can you do some? Ross, I'll give you Philippians 2:3 and 4. And Amy, Matthew 18:16. Can we go to the back row there? Kathy, 1 Corinthians. This is a little bit longer. It's going to be 6:1 through 8. And Andy, Matthew 18:17 through 20. So let's just read these and let's identify the peacemaking response. These are all going to be peacemaking responses. So Floyd, Proverbs 19:11.
19:11 Proverbs. Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense.
Okay, so what's the response there? Pretty obvious, right? Overlook.
Overlook.
And read that again. What does it say? Why is overlooking an offense profitable? Can you read that again?
Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense.
Wow. You ever think about that?
I thought about it a million times.
Yeah.
And if it keeps happening, how do you overlook it?
Exactly. Especially when, let's say someone is 100% at fault, and yet you have every reason to seek revenge or punishment or restitution, but you overlook it.
I was just born too late.
Yeah. But God says it's actually to your glory. And I don't know how this plays out, but when you think about when you're on the other side, when you're in glory, God is going to have a record of all the good you've done. And included in that good, I don't know how this manifests itself, but He sees every time you overlook an offense. And He counts that to your record. So it can actually bring you glory by doing that. So it's a tough one to do, but it's something that you are free to do. Like, nobody can prevent you from doing it. It's right there in your toolkit. All you got to do is pull it out and use it. So it's an easy one, but it's hard to do. But it is probably one of the most powerful ones to have. So overlooking. Okay, let's look at another one. So Matthew 5:23 and 24.
So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift.
Okay, so what would that be? reconciliation. So, I mean, if you think about that, he's speaking about church unity here. So we're walking in these doors today. He's saying, don't walk through these doors and worship me if you have something against your brother or your spouse or your child or whatever. He's saying it's more important that you reconcile before you come to me. Don't come to me with all these grudges. That's not what I want. I want unity in the church. So go reconcile with your brother and then come in here. So reconciliation. Again, that part of that is, it's not quite the same as overlooking, but it's you being willing to do whatever is needed to resolve a conflict so that you can come and worship in purity. That's the idea there. So reconciliation. Well,
on that verse, it says if your brother has something against you, right? So this isn't even if you have something against somebody else, just as if somebody else has an offense against you, even. So that's even, I don't know if you want to say a fuller or a deeper context to conflict, because it's not about the things that we think about internally that we might have with another person. It's about what somebody may have with you.
Yeah. But somebody has to take the first step. Somebody has to take the initiative. And if you got two parties and one is unwilling, whether you're more right or less right, are you willing to set all that aside and say, I need to reconcile this before I go in and worship God? Okay, let's look at another one. This is Philippians 2, 3, and 4.
Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others.
Okay, I'm not sure if it's directly in there, but what do you think in that? So you're considering your interest as well as others. What would that be? Phil?
Oh, well, I'm sorry. This may not be exactly what you're looking for, but those two verses back to back, if your brother has something against you, so it's not just, the flesh wants to say, well, it's not my problem, it's his problem. It's not my problem. So I'm not under any obligation to talk to that person because it's their problem, the anger's in their heart. But if you're considering their need, and their need is peace with God, they need to be able to worship God. So the Bible is calling us, to not just settle the conflict, but really care about the good of the other person. Right. And that's it's tough when you know somebody's upset at you, and yet you're called by God to go to them. The only reason you would do that, unless you just want to be a jerk, is because you care about them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so there's no absolutes on this, but this response elicits a peacemaking response. Some might call it a negotiation or a reconciliation. I think that's all embedded in there, in that process. Andy, you look like you're in deep thought.
I am in deep thought. I've been reading Titus, and one of the admonitions that Paul gives to Titus, after he says, teach these things and bear fruit, but then he says, don't let anyone despise you. So here's a young pastor, and he says, don't let anyone despise you. So what's he supposed to do? So kind of what Pastor Philip was saying, trying to help you. You don't want anyone to despise you. I mean, all of us like to be liked, right? But in this case, there's somebody may have an unreasonable, unhealthy attitude toward the pastor, and sounds like he's supposed to make a step toward diffusing that problem to keep someone from despising the pastor.
Yeah, and this is what's so tough, because when someone is particularly clearly in the wrong, God is calling you to think of our ultimate model, Jesus, and he's calling you to do what Jesus would do. And that's to at least try. So let's look at a few more real quick. Matthew 18:16.
But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church.
Okay.
If he refuses to listen to the church, treat him as a tax collector.
Yeah, and then right before that, Amy,
What's that?
Matthew 18:16.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you read that one too?
That's the one.
Okay, all right. So that's the accountability model, right? Go to him in private. If he refuses, bring up a couple others along. If not, tell it to the church. So that's the process that God is trying to get you to. But hopefully you don't ever get past the first step. Go in private and resolve it. That's really the biblical model.
But in the church setting, the church can't afford to really overlook.
Absolutely.
On a personal level, we can overlook offenses and things like that. The church can't overlook sin.
Right, and it's so important that that's part of our vows, right? We agree to the discipline of the church. Okay, let's look at one more and we'll wrap up. And this one's interesting. So Kathy, 1 Corinthians 6, 1 through 8. So listen to what Paul is saying here. See if you catch this.
When one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more, then, matters pertaining to this life? So, if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between brothers? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers? To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? But you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brothers.
Wow. So what is Paul saying here? Do you catch what's going on, big picture? So first of all, he's calling out to the Christians. He's saying, you're going to judge with God, and yet you're suing each other. You're going to the civil courts and you're taking these minuscule little issues. You need to resolve this yourselves. Do you have any thoughts on just expanding on that a little?
Sure, yeah. I mean, when people are suing each other, it's over things that are going to be done away with anyway. It's fighting for the scraps of the earth rather than focusing on the heavenly riches. And there are times, like Paul does, appeal to Caesar. There are times, but that's with regard to unbelievers. But with regard to two Christians, or two or more Christians in conflict, the church is called the judge. Now that also presupposes a certain ecclesiology where the church does have the authority to judge. Instead of an individualistic, just me and Jesus without any connection to the church. So, it's I could say a lot. I don't want to say too much.
and to the outside world, we're already experiencing persecution. When the outside world sees Christians quarreling and suing each other, what kind of example is that setting? So again, so the whole idea of this discussion, we'll wrap it up now, is a biblical model of peacemaking. This is really where we need to be. When we think about conflict, are we trying to go to our brother to resolve the conflict? Do we think about when we walk through these doors, do we have conflict with our spouse? Don gave a great example of just feeling shameful when he walked into the church because he had conflict with his wife, and he would go confess sins to his wife so that he could sit here and enjoy worship and enjoy communion. But again, this is all a biblical model of peacemaking. There's actually a much larger study where you kind of get down into the weeds. But this is what we want to take away, is this is where we need to be. We need to be peacemakers. We need to avoid the peace faking or the peace avoidance. And certainly, let's hope we never go into the peace breaking where we're assaulting or doing anything like that.
Did you put under the baking, is that what it says? Peacemaking, ignore?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I saw it.
Yep.
Didn't see that.
Absolutely.
So ignore and overlook are not the same thing.
No, they're not, are they? Overlook is implying that you're actively, I guess ultimately, in one sense, you might be forgiving, but it's being willing to overlook in a good, positive way. Ignoring is fleeing. It's that flight mechanism.
Maybe not physically, but emotionally.
It could be, absolutely.
He used denial also, which I said ignore, but I think denial is a better word for ignore. Just pretend like it doesn't even exist. You're not wrestling with it, you're just ignoring it.
Anyway, thank you for the time, and let's go out of here and try to be peacemakers. So let me pray. Lord, we do pray that as we come now to meet for corporate worship, that we would come with clear consciences. And I do pray that if there are disagreements amongst brothers and sisters, or within our households, or with our work associates, help us to think about this and give us the grace, Lord, particularly if it seems like that we're right in whatever the conflict is. Give us the ability to have a tender heart, to be willing to go and meet with individuals in private, to consider overlooking, to practice this biblical model of peacemaking. And may others be blessed by that. May they see things in us that maybe causes them to question, particularly if they're not Christians. So I just pray that we would be able to take this forward and to use it into our lives on a daily basis. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.